During the 16th and 17th centuries, Europe descended into an all-encompassing madness, a form of mass delusion pushed by nobility and the church. Hundreds of previously warring nations seemed to suddenly unite, or at the very least agree, that the greatest evil facing all of humanity were those in league with the devil, witches and sorcerers. This craze originated in mid-14th century Europe, with a small handful of scattered cases, but it would take some 200 years for this collective hysteria to enter the forefront of European society. And during that time, thousands of men, women and children were tried for practicing or associating with the demonic art of witchcraft. Those judged to be guilty faced horrific punishments, with the most common sentence being burned alive at the stake. During this horrific period, Scotland would hold more witch trials and executions than any other European nation. This historical atrocity was helmed by our then King, James VI of Scotland and First of England. You see, it was his belief that our little island was filled with devil worshippers and blasphemous evils. He would decree an all-out war against witchcraft, a scouring of the land to rid it of this insidious evil. So the great Scottish witch hunts would begin. The church and state in unison would arrest, torture and kill thousands of Scottish people in some of the most barbaric acts in recent history. One such victim of the so-called Great Scottish Witch Hunts was an elderly woman by the name of Lilias Adie. There is not much information known about Lilias before she was arrested. However, we do know that she was born in Fife in the 1640s, and seemed to live a very average life in the small village of Torryburn in Dunfermline. This area, and Fife in general, was one of the worst places hit by the witch hunts, due to their particular brand of violent religious fanaticism. The Torryburn minister, Alan Logan, was reported to be of this ilk, a zealous disciplinarian whose sermons demonised witchcraft and those associated with it. He had even gained a local reputation for his ability to identify witches. Yet it was in the year 1704 that a wicked rumour found its way to the minister's ears. A woman from the town by the name of Jean Bizet had spoken of her own personal torment at the hands of the devil. So on the 30th of June, Logan called a special meeting of the Kirk session in order to get to the bottom of these rumours. Multiple witnesses were called from the village and asked to give statements on the affliction of Jean Bizet. The various accounts created a single narrative in which Jean Bizet was seen acting very odd and erratic, screaming and calling out that Lilias Adie was coming for her and was a witch. One witness, a Mr. James White, told that Jean had been at Helen Anderson's house one evening with himself and some others. That night she had drank not a gill, but she acted strangely distempered. She called to Mrs. White and told her to beware lest Lilias Adie come upon you and your child. Then, as Mr. White tried to escort Jean home, believing she was drunk, the woman leapt out of his arms and took off running as if the very devil himself was behind her. He gave chase, but could not catch up to the terrified woman. White stated that over the next few days he was told by many in the village that Jean had not recovered from her illness. Upon being called by the Kirk, Helen Anderson told that Jean had indeed been in her house when she took ill, and seeing the sorry state of her afflicted friend, Helen quickly made up a bed and let Jean sleep there between the hours of 6 p.m. and 9 p.m. But when the woman awoke, she began to scream, "By God, he is going to take me! By Christ, he is going to take me! Oh Lilias, with her blue doublet, Christ keep me. Helen had never seen Jean act in this way, and was scared by her wild manner. She would then fetch Jean's husband, and ask of him if he had ever seen his wife in such a state, to which we are granted this hideous reply: "Never in my life, but she is much taken up with that company. Let me see her, and I will beat the devil fair." This session of the kirk was then closed, with the elders and minister retiring to discuss the case. Many were not sure what to think of the statements, if Jean Bizet truly was demented by Satan, or just had a little too much to drink. Even if the connection to the devil was to be believed, what evidence was there that Lilias Adie, the old widow woman, played any role in this possession? The Kirk Council decided to reach out to others in the village and make inquiries into the person of Lilias Adie. It was then when a second accusation came to light. A young woman by the name of Jean Nielsen, also alleged to have been horribly tormented by Lilias, and told of how she could hear her at night, and that Adie was coming for her. This second allegation cemented the thoughts of the council. Lilias was a witch, and would subsequently be arrested and imprisoned on the evening of July the 28th. The Kirk meeting on the 29th of July was the first in which Lilias was questioned. The following sessions discussing the case were to be held in the prison to allow Lilias to be questioned there. In all, she was interviewed 7 times, and taken to the kirk twice to make confession. At the first interrogation, after pledging to tell the truth, she was asked if she had conspired with the devil, to which the old woman replied, "I am in compact with the devil, and have been so since the second burning of the Fife witches." She told the horrified council that her first meeting with the devil had been at Gollet, just east of Torryburn, during the harvest season. She said that a voice had entered her mind, and tasked her with meeting the devil, or Al Clooty as he was known by some, on that very day. And true enough, as she arrived in Gollet, she beheld the horned visage of the devil. He took Lilias out into a field, and caused her to renounce her baptism by use of a curious ceremony. He placed a warm hand on the crown of her head, and another on the soles of her feet, to which then he bade her to call, "All belongs to the devil, betwixt crown and soles." Once brought into this infernal covenant, the devil and Lilias would lay together in carnal pleasure. The ageing resident of Torryburn went on to describe not only that hedonistic act, but also the beast himself. Though his hands were warm, his body was ice cold, his colour dark and pale, his feet cloven like an animal's. And all throughout their meeting, the devil wore a bunnet. Our next encounter, while Clooty, was at the great gathering of witches in Barnrods. Lilias was invited to attend by another in the coven of Satan, one Griselle Anderson of New Milne. Upon her arrival to this black mass, Adie beheld around 20 or 30 other figures, dancing and celebrating, their naked bodies lit by the silver moonlight. After some hours, the devil himself arrived, seated upon a small horse, and once more supporting his bunnet. Then the gathered coven cheered and screamed in joy, while crying, "There is our prince! There is our prince!" And soon the devil joined the cavorting orgy of evil. Another time, Lilias joined a meeting of local witches in Valleyfield. There the devil arrived in a great long cloak, although strangely, Lilias mentioned that on that particular night there was no moon, and so the meeting was entirely shrouded in darkness. When asked by the council if there was any light, and if not, how did the gathered see what was happening, Adie's chilling response was that she took the light from the darkness. She was unsure what this dark light was, yet it gave some light, less luminous than a candle, and cast her vision in shades of blue. They remained in the meeting house for little over an hour, dancing and chanting, all in the praise of his satanic majesty. She did not know any other women at the meeting, except someone by the name of Elsbeth Williamson, who arrived at the close of the gathering. Lilias stated that she had met Williamson at 3 other gatherings at the Hall of Torre. She continued to tell the council that there were many dances and masses which took place that she did not attend, and there were just as many that she did, but could not remember or give them account of any particular detail. The Kirk Council would then take this opportunity to ask Lilias some curious questions of their own. The first being, was she aware of the name of any other witch in the area? The old woman told them that the only other she knew was Agnes Curry, but she was a bold woman and a powerful enchanter who would do evil upon me if it was known I gave her name. The interrogators then asked if the devil was known to carry with him a sword or weapon during these meetings. She told them that the beast never carries a sword, as he has no need of it, but she did state that he was a villain, and he promised her many good things over the years, yet gave her nothing but poverty and misery. She was told to inform the council of her final meeting with the devil, which Lilias revealed had occurred 14 days after the sacrament, in the month of August in 1701. The gathering, strangely enough, was held on the local minister's land, in a great tent, as if mocking or snubbing God with its very location. There, 16 of the Covenant and the Beast assembled to dance and plan wicked schemes. During this, Lilias spoke to the others and apologised, for she could not remain with the cavorting witches that night, as early in the morning she had to be in Burriston Ness. She added at the end of her confession that she had indeed heard of the possession of Jean Bissett, and how she had been troubled with a fit of distemper, but declared that it was never she who wronged her, though the devil will take whomever he wants, and may have wronged her in the guise of Lilias as some kind of mischief. After the many interrogations of Lilias Adie, the Kirk Council would speak with all 3 of the women who were named during her confession. The first was Griselle Anderson, who fully admitted to being a witch and inviting Lilias to meet with the coven on Lammas Tide. Griselle was quickly sentenced to death for her part in the rampant witchcraft flowing through Torryburn. She was tied to the stake, strangled, and finally burned alive. The second to be accused was Elsbeth Williamson, who, when asked if she was a witch, said that she did not rightly know, but could not deny that it was a possibility. She told that shortly after her last communion, an unknown young woman came to her door and bade her travel east. Elsbeth would follow this woman past the churchyard, where they came upon an assembly of black-robed people entering a large tent. Elsbeth and the strange woman joined the procession, and once inside the tent, all fell upon their knees and began to chant. At first, Miss Williamson thought the group were praying, and that soon there would be a reading from the Bible or a singing of psalms. But then, to her utter horror, she realised that the woman had taken her to the devil's meeting. With all haste, she leapt up and ran for home, luckily escaping the beast and the coven with her immortal soul intact. Some days later, another young woman appeared at her door and told Elsbeth to follow her west, which the woman seemed compelled to obey. Upon leaving the town and heading through some farmland, Elsbeth saw a meeting of men and women in the distance, and dared not move closer. She watched for more than an hour as the gathered few danced and cast off their clothes. It was only then Elsbeth noticed the young woman who had been with her had vanished. This brought her to her senses, and she ran home, never again to be bothered by spirits or devilry. Unlikely as it may seem, this testimony may have saved Elsbeth, as I cannot find any record of punishment, confession, or death. The final and most feared accomplice of Adie's was Agnes Curry, a name that was not only brought up by Lilias, but also by both of the other accused witches, and 6 other villagers. One Mr. Stewart told the council that Agnes told him that she could give him the secret to powers beyond God, for which the man replied, "I believe in Christ, and hope the devil hath no power over me." Agnes laughed at the man and said, "The devil hath done wrong to many, and may yet do wrong to you and yours," which Mr. Stewart took as a threat against him and his family. Another man, James Patton, told that Agnes alleged to him that his sister was involved with the devil, and that she knew this to be true. Another man by the name of William Wilson stated that 24 years ago, his neighbour, Helen Johnston, had given birth, and the child had quickly passed on the very night of its christening. That same evening, Agnes said to him, if she had been the midwife, as she had advised Helen, the child would still be alive. He further mentioned that Agnes was to save his ill horse, but as the man could not fetch her a very special form of clay, she left and let the horse die. But it was not only the men of the village who had problems with Agnes Curry. A woman by the name of Janet Glass also had testimony of Agnes's witchcraft, as on one day Janet went to Agnes's home, where she was baking, and would offer Janet a small piece of oat bannock, which upon consumption made her terribly ill with a fever. Now this bannock-based magic is also reinforced by one Helen Lawson, as she was offered 3 pieces of bannock from Agnes. After the first, she fell ill. After the second, she was taken by a powerful ailment, and while Agnes motioned her to take the third, Helen did not dare, and ran from the house. She was willing to swear in front of the church that the final mouthful would have killed her. After a much longer trial, and many more testimonies, and another 8 alleged witches, Agnes would also be sentenced to death and strangled on the stake before being burned alive. But then where does that leave our Lilias Adie? Well, fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on your point of view, she would never make it to the stake. In fact, she would die in prison on the 29th of August 1704. It was said by many at the time that this was due to her old age, and her body could not stand the torture she had suffered during her time in prison. But while many witches were subjected to horrific machines and implements designed to cause unbelievable pain in order to extract a confession, this was not the case for Lilias Adie. But don't get me wrong, although the methods were more simple, it was still torture of the most horrific kind. Lilias was subjected to 24-hour surveillance and complete sleep deprivation, a process for which the Church had fought to keep and uphold in 1649, when the leaders of the Scottish Church would appear before the Committee of States in Edinburgh to argue their case for keeping this horrific process alive. The practice of sleep deprivation was known to many as waking the witch, which basically involved keeping the accused awake for many days and sometimes months on end. This would be done by throwing water on them and leaving them to essentially freeze, or by inflicting pain, or simply by shaking them awake every time they attempted to sleep. Another tactic would be to keep the accused in a small cell so they could not lie down, and force them to stand 24 hours a day, dragging them from the floor back to their feet each time they fell. Sleep deprivation can begin to have negative side effects on the body after just one day. Psychologically, it leads to poor attention and concentration, along with memory loss, and during extended periods it can facilitate hallucinations and even extreme psychosis. There are also many physical effects of sleep deprivation, ranging from lower immune function to increased blood pressure and even weight gain. When the body becomes fully deprived of sleep, usually after 3 to 6 days, then the psychological need for rest becomes an overwhelming obsession, exceeding the need for food or water. This horrifyingly painful and negative state of mind will force people to do nearly anything to end their suffering, including the admission of witchcraft. The practice of sleep deprivation as a form of torture has existed for many centuries due to its efficiency and reliability. It was in common use throughout Scotland during the Great Witch Hunts, since the horrific, hallucinatory states gained by the practice would often produce wild and fantastical confessions concerning covens and magic and devils. This not only condemned the witch, but more so bolstered the religious fanaticism of the church. It proved not only to their flock, but also to themselves, that witches and devils were in fact real, solidifying religious truth and righteousness in Scotland. Not to mention the social and political power it gained for the church as an institution. The common fate of a convicted witch in Scotland was to be burned alive, but Lilias had died before being sentenced, so in some regard she was never officially a witch, although this fact did little to persuade the locals. And it was decided that Lilias could not be buried in the graveyard, or any consecrated ground for that matter, as she was, in all accounts, in league with the devil. It was decided that her body would be placed in a humble wooden box, and buried between the high tide and low tide marks in the Torryburn Bay. Once the wooden box was sealed within the hole, an immense stone slab was placed atop. This was due to fears of the devil possessing her body, and returning or rising from the grave to wreak vengeance upon the people who caused her death. This meant that the grave of Lilias Adie lay beneath the sea for roughly 12 hours of each day, and is the only known grave of its kind in Scotland. More than 100 years later, in 1852, a party from Torryburn decided to exhume the remains of Lilias Adie, an action which many believe was suggested by local antiquarian Joseph Neil Paton, a man with a love of folklore and Celtic history, but with a morbid fascination for the occult and objects once possessed or related to witches or witchcraft. It was said that the remains of Lilias Adie were in good condition. She had been a surprisingly tall woman for the time, at around 6 foot, and her teeth were said to be in very good condition. Sickeningly, many parts of her body and coffin were sold to interested parties and various occultists as souvenirs. Part of the coffin was made into a walking cane with a silver ring atop, which read Lilias Adie, 1704. This is believed to have been commissioned and owned by the industrialist and philanthropist Andrew Carnegie, before being left to the Pittencrieff House Museum in Dunfermline in 1927. But the crown, touched by the very hands of the devil himself, was the greatest trinket of Joseph Neil Paton, and existed in his private museum until 1875, when it was left to his son. The skull of Lilias would next appear in an exhibit by the Fifeshire Medical Association in 1884, where it was owned by a medical doctor with the surname of Dow, who came from Dunfermline. Next it was held at the Museum of the University of St Andrews, where it was photographed in 1904. Finally, the skull of Lilias Adie was exhibited in 1938 at the Empire Exhibition at Bellahouston Park in Glasgow, and has never been seen again. No one seems to know what exactly happened to the skull, or even who was last in possession of it. In 2017, a team of forensic artists from the Centre of Anatomy and Human Identification at the University of Dundee used the many photos taken of the skull in 1904 to construct a three-dimensional virtual model of what Lilias may have looked like. A little time before that, in 2014, the Fife Council even launched a campaign to discover what had happened to Lilias Adie's remains, including the whereabouts of the skull, in order to give them a proper burial. But to this very day, there continues to be no new information. Thank you for listening. And a special thank you to all my wonderful patrons for all the support and allowing me to keep these tales alive. Many believe that Lilias was a rather intelligent woman and basically good-hearted, for when asked to give names of local witches, she told only of those who were either previously accused or currently in prison suspected of witchcraft. Even under the brutal torture, she seems to have tried to limit the damage that her statements would cause, and not bring this horrendous torment on any others. One very interesting suggestion is that the local minister, Alan Logan, this paragon of religious justice, may have been in league with the witches. Many locals after his death told of his general strangeness and fascination with witchcraft. Not to mention, they would question the alleged black masses and naked cavorting rituals that seemed to occur on his property. Some believe he was the true evil and gave the names of the women to cover for his own actions. I believe he may have been the true evil, but for a very different reason. It has been suggested that the reason Lilias was buried out below the tide was that her death may have been suicide, induced by the deprivation and torture. Suicide was a major taboo during the 18th century. It was classed as a mortal sin, meaning that the person would never reach heaven and were damned for eternity. For this reason, it was common for those who committed suicide not to be buried on consecrated ground. People have theorized that this may have been the cause of the strange burial ground of Lilias Adie, for which the great stone grave can still be seen in the Torryburn Bay. Lilias was arrested and thrown into prison. She was then interrogated and tortured for over a month, eventually leading to her death. Her body was entombed underwater in a disrespectful manner, before her corpse was exhumed and dismantled and dismembered to be sold as souvenirs and curios to a rabid public. Her remains were then displayed and put on show as a form of morbid rarities: the skull of a real witch, the bones of Lilias Adie. With all this mass publicity and spectacle, it is difficult to remember that she could have been any one of us. She was an innocent woman who deserved respect in both life and death. Once more, I bring you the horrors of the great witch hunts, in the hope of reminding some that we are always on the brink of mass hysteria, where murder becomes justice, and the most extreme become our rulers. Let us all learn from the mistakes of Scotland's past, and know that most of the villagers of Torryburn were not bad people. They were just trying to get by in life, when they were caught up in a storm of power struggles, paranoia, accusations, and mindless violence. I wish you and all your kin to stay safe, and until the next time, Slán